The morning sky over Manhattan was the color of bruised porcelain, thin light drifting between buildings like a held breath. By 7:15 a.m., the city had already begun its relentless churn. Car horns in discord, footsteps on wet concrete, distant, sirens weaving in and out like ghost threads. But on the corner of West 73rd and Columbus, in an aging brownstone that had weathered generations of quiet tenants and gentrified ambition, the day stalled. Something had stopped. Detective Riley Monroe stepped out of the unmarked Crown Vic, the cold pressing against her collarbone as she looked up at the third floor of the brownstone. A single window there, slightly ajar despite the chill, caught her eye. Faint lace curtains trembled. She felt it before she knew it. That ripple in the air that never quite meant danger, but always meant change. Uniformed officers cordoned off the stoop with yellow tape that sagged slightly in the wind. A young patrolman she didn't know nodded toward the door. Apartment 3B. Victim's name is Eleanor Roth. Neighbor from 2A made the call after smelling something strange from the hall vent. Maintenance opened the door with the master key. No sign of forced entry. Riley didn't answer. Right away. She was watching the building, or rather, listening to it. People tend to think cities are loud, chaotic, indistinct. But if you stand still long enough, listen hard enough, you start to hear things. The hesitation in a neighbor's cough behind a closed door. The way footsteps pause too long on a stair. The silence where something should be. She crossed the threshold. Inside, the brownstone was dim and narrow, hallways breathing with the age of the building. The walls bore years of repainting, pale beige upon beige, like a history trying to erase itself. A flight of creaking stairs brought her to the third floor, where a female officer stood waiting outside apartment 3B. "You're going to want to see this for yourself," the officer said, eyes uncertain. "It's unsettling." Riley stepped inside. The apartment was small, neat, almost overly so. Every object was in its place. Magazines stacked on a side table. By the window, cushions symmetrical on the faded green couch, a porcelain teacup rinsed but still drying beside the sink. There was no clutter, no chaos. Except for the woman on the floor. Eleanor Roth lay in the middle of the living room, just beside the edge of an old Persian rug. She was barefoot, dressed in a pale blue housecoat, her silver hair loose around her. Shoulders, eyes closed, lips parted slightly as if she'd fallen asleep mid-thought. A single bloodless tear had dried on her cheek. There were no wounds, no signs of a struggle, just stillness. A forensic tech glanced up from the body. Estimated time of death is somewhere between 36 and 48 hours ago. No trauma. No signs of overdose. We'll need tox results, but it's strange. Was she sick? Nothing visible. Medications in the cabinet are mild. Blood pressure, thyroid, a mild anti-anxiety. Could be natural, but he hesitated. It doesn't feel like that. Riley knelt beside the body, studying the line of Eleanor's jaw, the faint creases in her neck. She wasn't young, perhaps late 60s, early 70s, but her expression was too composed, as if death hadn't surprised her at all, as if she'd seen it coming and decided not to argue. "Who found her?" Riley asked. "Neighbor from 2A. His name's Theo Martin. Said he hadn't seen her in a couple days, which wasn't like her. They talked through the floorboards sometimes. Knocks, and such. Said he started noticing the smell yesterday, but didn't want to jump to conclusions. Today he heard her cat crying." Riley looked around. No sign of a cat. The officer answered her glance. "We found it under the bed. It hasn't left." Her side. Hissing at everyone. "We'll get animal control." "Don't," Riley said quietly. "Let it be for now." She stood and walked to the kitchen. The sink was empty. The refrigerator hummed. On the small dining table sat a single plate with the remains of toast and jam, a second cup of tea untouched across from the drying one in the sink. Eleanor had made breakfast for two. She stared at the chair opposite. Who had been meant to sit? There, or had someone? Riley opened the drawer beside the table. Neatly arranged silverware. A row of folded napkins, a letter opener. A single envelope tucked into the side, addressed but never mailed. She slid it out. The name read Graham Roth. No return address, just a date, 3 days ago, a husband, a brother. No photos on the wall, no family portraits, just a framed sketch of the Brooklyn Bridge, and a small ceramic angel resting on the radiator. No dust on it, freshly cleaned. Riley turned to the window. From here, she could see across the alley into the neighboring building. Another brownstone, curtains drawn. The city moved outside like a film reel, unaware that anything had stopped here. Footsteps sounded behind her. A man in his mid-50s with thinning hair and a stooped posture appeared in the doorway. He wore a cardigan, buttoned wrong. His eyes were rimmed with red. "I'm Theo," he said, from downstairs. Riley nodded. "You knew her well?" "Not well, not exactly. She was quiet, reserved, but kind. She'd slip letters under my door sometimes. Poems she'd written. She didn't like to talk out loud much, but she trusted you. She said I listened." Riley studied him for a beat too long. His fingers twitched. His shoes were damp. He looked exhausted. "Do you know if she had any family? Anyone who visited?" He shook his head. "Never saw anyone." "But she wasn't alone. Not really, she talked to someone." "What do you mean?" Theo swallowed. "Sometimes I'd hear her. Late at night, talking to someone upstairs, but..." He hesitated, voice thinning. "There's no apartment above her. Just the attic. Locked up for years." Riley's gaze slid upward. The ceiling overhead was smooth plaster, slightly yellowed at the edges. A single square outline marked a trapdoor. "Who has keys to this apartment?" she asked. Theo blinked. "Everyone, technically. Old building. When we moved in, the super gave each office a master key. Said it was tradition, for emergencies." "How many tenants?" "4 of us, me in 2A, the Garcias in 1B, Mrs. Cresswell in 1A, and a man in 2B, Nate Llewellyn, writer, keeps to himself." Riley said nothing. She looked at the untouched teacup again, then at the small angel on the radiator, and something inside her shifted. Not a realization, not yet, but a weight, a question without shape. Outside, the city roared on, but inside apartment 3B, the silence pressed closer. Closer. Somewhere above, something waited. Riley remained still beneath the attic trapdoor, her gaze fixed on its faintly discolored outline. In an older building like this, sealed spaces often held nothing but dust and insulation. Still, the way Theo had said it, she talked to someone upstairs, lingered like a whisper behind Hirar. A building was never just a building. It had moods, breath, secrets. She turned away from the ceiling and made a slow sweep through the rest of Eleanor Roth's apartment. The bedroom was sparse, a single iron frame bed with a neatly made quilt, a worn paperback on the nightstand, and a radio tuned to static. The closet held little beyond 2 long coats and 3 pairs of shoes, each precisely aligned. No clutter, no hidden compartments. But when Riley opened the bottom drawer of the bureau, her hand paused. Inside, folded in a careful grid, were dozens of letters. None were mailed. All were addressed to the same name, Graham Roth. The earliest was dated 15 years ago. The most recent, last week. She picked one at random. "Graham, the rain was loud tonight. I thought I heard your voice in it again. It comes, in flashes now. The way you would say my name when you were angry, like it burned your throat. I don't think I'm angry anymore, just hollow. But it's strange, isn't it? How grief chooses what to keep alive. Yours is the voice I can't." Forget Riley read it twice, then placed it back exactly as she'd found it. Whoever Graham was, he hadn't been part of Eleanor's recent life, not physically at least, but emotionally, he was threaded through it. Regret, longing, resentment. It was all there, pulsing. Beneath Eleanor's outward neatness, grief had many disguises. She stepped back into the living room. Theo stood by the door, arms folded tightly, as if unsure whether to stay or leave. "You said you'd hear her talking," Riley said carefully. "Did you ever make out what she was saying?" Theo hesitated. "Sometimes. Bits and pieces. She'd Say names. But not mine. She never said mine. Do you remember any of them? He rubbed at his jaw. Graham, mostly. And another. Anne or Annie. Like she was having conversations with them. Half of it didn't make sense. Did she ever seem confused? No. Theo's answer was sharp. Not confused, she was clear. Lonely, maybe. But she wasn't losing her mind. Riley nodded, eyes steady on him. And the attic? Do you know why it's locked? Mrs. Cresswell might. She's been here the longest. Since before I moved in. How long ago was that? 11 years, so Eleanor had been here at least that long, possibly more. Enough time to become invisible. Riley thanked Theo and stepped out into the hallway. The building felt heavier now, each creak of the floorboards carrying weight. She descended to the first floor, stopping at apartment 1A. A tapped paper label on the door read, M. Cresswell. She knocked. A long pause. Then slow, deliberate steps. The door cracked open. Mrs. Cresswell stood in a brown wool sweater and orthopedic slippers, her face carved with time but not softened by it. Her eyes were sharp, pale blue, unblinking. You're the detective, she said, not asked. I am. Riley Monroe. Mrs. Cresswell opened the door wider. I don't like police in my home, but I hate gossip more. Come in. The apartment smelled of lavender and old paper. Antique furniture crowded the room like well-behaved ghosts. Riley followed the older woman to a chair, declining the one offered. I assume this is about poor Eleanor, Mrs. Cresswell said, folding her hands. She was a strange one, but not unkind. We kept to ourselves, mostly. She lived here. A long time? Longer than anyone else. 20, maybe 25 years. Came after her divorce, I believe. Changed her name. Didn't want to be found. That caught Riley's attention. She changed her name. She was Eleanor Graham when she moved in, then Roth. Quiet switch. Never explained it, but she didn't have to. We all live here for a reason, usually the same one. We don't want to be noticed. Do you know who Graham was? Husband? Mrs. Cresswell tilted her head. If I had to guess, yes. But there was a daughter, too, once. A teenager. Moved in with her at first, but didn't stay long. They fought. I heard yelling. One night, the next day the girl was gone. Never saw her again. Do you remember her name? Annie? Or Anna? It's been years, so Eleanor had a daughter. Riley filed it away like a knife slipped into a drawer. And the attic? She asked. Mrs. Cresswell's face darkened slightly. Locked for as long as I've lived here. I believe the landlord keeps it that way on purpose. There was an incident years ago, before my time. Something about a squatter, or someone who didn't want to come down. Anyone ever go up recently? Not that I've seen, but sometimes, at night, it sounds like someone's walking up there. Could be the pipes. Old buildings talk. Riley knew better than to dismiss the murmurings of a place like this. Buildings were memory palaces. They stored everything, especially what people wanted to forget. Back outside, she walked the length of the hallway, stopping at 2B. Nate Llewellyn's door. The writer. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again. Louder. Finally, a shuffle. The door opened halfway, revealing a gaunt man in his late 30s, unshaven, eyes shadowed. A t-shirt clung to his thin frame. Yes? Detective Monroe? NYPD? May I ask you a few questions? He leaned against the doorframe. You can ask. Doesn't mean I'll answer. Ask doesn't. Riley didn't blink. Your neighbor, Eleanor Roth, was found dead upstairs. I figured. Cops everywhere. Did you know her? Not really. Saw her in the stairwell once a month, maybe? She didn't talk. I didn't push. Did you ever hear her at night, talking to anyone? He laughed once, short and bitter. Lady talked to ghosts. Half the people in this building do. This place is like a halfway house for broken dreams. That include you? He looked at her, surprised. You always this blunt? Only with people who pretend not to care? A beat passed. Then he said, she wasn't crazy. She was haunted. Big difference. By what? Wish I knew. Maybe that's why I stayed. He closed the door. Riley stood alone in the hall, heart tapping slower now, like a clock winding down. Eleanor had been grieving something, or someone, for decades. A man named Graham, a daughter named Annie, a locked attic no one opened. Every tenant in the building had a key, but Eleanor hadn't let anyone in. So who had she let close? Back. Upstairs, Riley returned to the apartment. The forensic team had begun packing up. She moved through the living room once more, slow, deliberate. Her eyes scanned everything. The neatness, the symmetry, the way the untouched cup had cooled into stillness. Then she saw it. A faint scuff on the inside of the apartment doorframe. Fresh. Not dusted yet. Barely visible unless you were looking for it. It wasn't a forced entry, but someone had hesitated there. Before they left. Before they closed the door. Riley stepped back, heart pulsing again. Not with fear, with clarity. This wasn't just a death. It was a visit, and someone hadn't planned to stay long. The apartment had grown colder. Riley stood in the doorway of Eleanor Roth's home, as if the shape of the room had changed in her absence. Something had. The forensic team was gone now, the silence reclaimed. The untouched teacup still sat like a question on the table. And somewhere beyond it, behind layers of wood, memory, and plaster, the attic waited. She stepped back inside and closed the door behind her. It clicked softly. That click stirred something. She turned and looked at the latch. New. Brass polished to a brighter shine than the rest of the apartment. No scratches around it, no sign of age. Someone had changed it recently, but the locks on the outside door didn't match what she'd seen elsewhere in the building. The others were older, original. She crouched, ran her finger along the screws. Stripped, slightly. Amateur installation, done quickly. Eleanor had changed her lock, from the inside, to keep someone out. Or in. Riley rose, scanning the space with new eyes. She wasn't looking for signs of violence now. She was looking for signs of intent, for the careful edits someone had made to a life they wanted to hide. She crossed to the kitchen and opened the narrow cabinet above the stove. Inside, amid spice jars and a single dusty bottle of sherry, she found it, a compact toolkit. Screwdrivers, a flashlight, masking tape, 2 unused locks still in their packaging, a woman preparing for something, a woman bracing, and suddenly the picture began to shift. Eleanor hadn't died by accident. She'd been waiting. Riley left the apartment, her boots falling softly on the wooden floorboards. She didn't head downstairs. She turned and faced the ceiling again. The attic. The trap door was unassuming, painted the same beige as the rest of the ceiling, with a slight crack on the corner. No ladder, no pull string. Someone would need a chair or a broom handle to reach it, but the frame was dusty, uneven. She knocked once. No answer. Not that she expected one. Still, she retrieved a broom from Eleanor's hall closet and nudged the edge of the panel. It didn't budge. She tried again, firmer this time. Nothing. Then, the faintest movement, a shift, not the panel. The air above it. It felt aware. Her phone buzzed. She stepped back instinctively as if startled from a dream. The name on the screen read, Detective Vega, her partner still wrapping another scene uptown. She answered. I've got a dead woman. With no cause, a missing daughter, a locked attic, and an untouched cup of tea for someone who never arrived, she said by way of greeting. Vega whistled. So. Tuesday, then. Riley smiled faintly, the sound of his voice grounding her for a moment. I need you to pull everything you can on Eleanor Roth. Past names, previous addresses. Look for anyone named Graham connected to her. Possibly a daughter named Annie or Anna. We may be dealing with an alias. Something feels off. I'll run it, Vega said. Anything else? She hesitated. Then, send someone to talk to the landlord. I want the original layout of this building and keys, every copy accounted for. There's something wrong with the attic. A pause. You think someone's been living up there? He asked. I think someone still might be. It was after 5 when Riley returned to the building. Golden light began to crawl across the brownstones facade, turning the grime into something soft and almost reverent. She entered without announcing herself and knocked on 1B, the Garcias. A teenage girl opened the door, maybe 17, with wide, intelligent eyes and a streak of blue in her dark hair. She looked Riley up and down. "You're not the super." "No," Riley said. "I'm a detective. Can I talk to your parents?" The girl shrugged, disappearing inside. A moment later, her mother appeared, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Sorry to bother you," Riley said. "I'm following up on the death upstairs. Did either of you know Eleanor Roth?" Mrs. Garcia nodded slowly. She was quiet, polite. "We didn't talk much, but she used to feed the birds out back. My daughter said she would sing sometimes. Very soft, very early in the morning." "Sing? What?" "Old things. Lullabies. Hymns, maybe." Riley made a note of it. "Did she have any visitors lately?" "No. Not that I saw. But sometimes at night, I thought I heard footsteps. Overhead. My husband says it's the heat shifting in the attic, but..." She hesitated. "It didn't sound like a house breathing. It sounded like a person." "Did you ever mention it to Eleanor?" "She'd always smile and say, 'Some ghosts just need company.'" Riley felt her pulse beat once, slow and deliberate. She thanked the woman and turned to leave. As she did, the teenage girl called after her. "She talked about someone named Anne once," she said. "To me. When I helped her with her groceries." Riley turned. "She said she had a daughter, that they'd argued, that she'd said something she couldn't take back." "What was it?" I asked, but she wouldn't tell me. She just said, "A mother can forgive a child, but not herself." Riley stood in front of the trapdoor again at dusk. This time, she brought a stepladder from the precinct. The attic groaned faintly as she climbed, pressing her hand to the frame. The hatch stuck for a moment, then gave with a reluctant creak. Dust flurried down into her face. She coughed, eyes watering. Then she shone her flashlight up. Wooden beams, a single strip of pale insulation, and in the far corner, a mattress, a worn blanket, an old suitcase, and next to it, a crumpled photograph. Riley climbed the last few steps and crouched low, the floorboards soft with damp. The photo was black and white, faded with time. A woman with younger eyes, Eleanor, stood beside a man, and a child. The girl was maybe 8, hair wind-blown, her face half-turned. On the back of the photo, written in uneven ink, "Anne, Coney Island, 1994. Riley looked around. There were signs of life, a dented tin cup, food wrappers, a paperback, splayed face down and scrawled on the wall. In charcoal or something darker, were words. "I didn't mean to stay this long. I just needed to hear her sing again. I didn't know she'd stop." Riley's throat tightened. This wasn't a squatter. This was someone Eleanor knew. Someone who had once sat at her table. She rose and turned slowly. In the beam of the flashlight, a shape emerged near the beams. A woman, thin, wild-eyed, wrapped in a coat 2 sizes too big. She didn't move. Riley lowered the flashlight. "Anne?" No answer. "Anne Roth. Or Graham. I think you're her daughter." A pause. Then the woman said, voice like dry leaves, "She said she didn't hate me anymore." Riley stepped forward, cautious. "She didn't. She never did. She made tea for me," Anne said. "I watched her every morning, but I couldn't go down. I couldn't. Not after..." She broke off. "After what?" Riley asked softly. Anne shook her head. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I just needed to be close. Just for a while." Riley stepped closer, heart pacing steadily. "She saw you, didn't she?" she said. "She let you up here, gave you food, let you stay, even when she was scared. But then something changed." Anne's eyes shone in the dark. "She said we could start again. She made me toast, like when I was a kid." "What happened, Anne?" Anne closed her eyes and said nothing. The silence in the attic wasn't empty. It was taut, like a held breath. Riley waited, her flashlight lowered to the floorboard so it wouldn't blind the woman crouched in the shadows. Anne had tucked, her knees to her chest, face turned away, hair straggling over her cheek like torn fabric. In the half-light, she looked smaller than Riley had expected, not in stature, but in spirit. A grown woman sunk inside the shape of a frightened child. What happened, Anne? Still no answer. Just a long, trembling breath. Riley stepped closer. Not fast, just enough that she could kneel without towering. She kept her hands in view. She didn't ask again. Silence could be a sanctuary if you let it breathe. After a minute, Anne spoke. She wasn't supposed to know. Her voice was hoarse. Brittle with memory. I just needed somewhere to go. I saw the building on a list once, when I was looking for her, years ago. I thought, if I got close, maybe I could say the things I should have said before. But she looked right through me the first time we passed on the stairs, so I knew it had to be like this. Quiet, unseen. Riley nodded, careful not to disrupt the current. You stayed up here, watching her. Anne's eyes darted toward the hatch. At first, just a few nights. Then winter came. Then she started leaving food out, like I was a stray. A bowl of soup. A folded note. Be warm. That's what she wrote the first time. Just that. Did you talk to her? Eventually. Her voice cracked. We never said what we needed to. Just things like the weather, her migraines, my favorite book when I was little. She laughed, short and dry, as if you can stitch a family back together with weather and Tolstoy. Riley didn't move. She knew better than to touch broken glass while it was still shifting. Did anyone else know you were up here? Anne shook her head. No one ever comes up. She kept the key herself. She said the landlord never checked. After a while, it felt like it didn't matter if I was real or not. But you were. You were real to her. Anne blinked. She sang to me once, the night I got sick, fever or something. She sat just outside the hatch and sang the lullaby she used to sing when I had earaches as a kid. She didn't ask what I'd done. She didn't accuse. She just sang. Riley exhaled slowly. Anne, did something happen between the two of you before all this? Something that made you leave all those years ago? Anne's jaw tensed. The words came in pieces. I told her once that she'd ruined my life, that Dad leaving was her fault. I threw things. I hit the wall with a glass. I think she thought I was like him, that I had the same switch under me ribs. And then I packed a bag and disappeared. I didn't call, not for a decade. I thought she'd be better without me. She wasn't. No, Anne whispered. She wasn't. Back in the apartment below, Riley sat at the kitchen table. The tea was cold now. 2 cups, one untouched, one half empty. A little circle of lipstick on Therum. Anne sat across from her, shivering beneath a borrowed NYPD sweater. She hadn't asked for a lawyer. She hadn't asked to leave. She looked like a woman still trying to catch up to her own life. I didn't kill her, she said suddenly, quietly. Not defensive, just stating a fact she needed to believe. I'm not accusing you, Riley replied, but something happened. That part's clear. Anne looked down at her hands, folded tightly together. She said she wanted to try again. Last week, she asked if I wanted to come down, sit with her. She made me toast with butter, like it was 1995 again. But it was too normal, like she'd already decided how it would end. What do you mean? She gave me back an old book I'd left as a kid, Charlotte's Web, said, it was mine. And that night, she locked the attic from the outside for the first time in weeks. Riley's pulse stirred. She locked it. Anne nodded. She told me she needed to clean, said she'd be back the next morning. But she never came. Did you try to get out? I could have pushed, broken the hatch, but I didn't. I thought maybe she just needed time. I didn't want to scare her. Riley's mind moved like a knife through silk. Why lock her up again after all that time? Unless Eleanor had sensed something, or someone else had. She pulled out her phone and texted Vega. Need Eleanor's toxicology panel expedited. 'Cause still uncertain. Cross-reference visitor logs. Also, who else has attic access? She didn't. Expect an immediate answer. But it helped to ask. Helped to narrow the net. She looked back at Anne. Did anyone else know you were here? Anyone who might have seen you come or go? No. Maybe that man from 2B. The writer. I heard him one night on the stairs, drunk. He talks to himself, sometimes to others. Nate Llewellyn. The man who lived in metaphors and shadows. Riley remembered. His words. This place is like a halfway house for broken dreams. Maybe it wasn't just a metaphor. She knocked on 2B at midnight. Nate opened the door slower this time. No sarcasm. Just fatigue. And something like wariness. I'm not here to play games, Riley said before he could speak. I think you know more than you said earlier. He sighed. You don't stop, do you? No, he stepped aside. You want the real story? Fine. His apartment was chaos. Stacked books, loose papers, ashtrays with burned-out cigarettes. The walls were yellowing with old coffee fumes. Heard her, he said once they were seated. Talking to someone, not just muttering, laughing, arguing sometimes. Full sentences. I thought she'd finally cracked. But then one night I saw someone, a shadow in the stairwell, long coat, messy hair. I only saw her for a second. You never reported it? I'm a writer. I'm supposed to observe, not interfere. And if someone died? He looked up. She wasn't afraid. She wanted her there. That was obvious. And then she wasn't. The day Eleanor stopped singing, the building felt different. Like something had shut its eyes. Riley stood. If you see anything else, you come to me. No metaphors, just facts. Outside, the night had grown windless. Still. Riley crossed the street and stood beneath the yellow glow of the streetlight, looking up at the building. 3 floors. 10 windows. And behind one of them, a woman had waited 2 decades for forgiveness, only to die before she could decide if she deserved it. Inside, Anne slept. Or tried to. And Riley stood in the hush of early morning, sensing the story wasn't finished. Someone else had been there. She could feel it in her bones. In the chill left behind in the apartment. In the careful lock replaced too recently. Grief left fingerprints. But fear left patterns. She just hadn't seen them yet. By noon, the building had settled into its usual weekday hush. A mix of muffled TVs, the faint sound of someone vacuuming, 2 floors down, and the creak of a radiator pipe that had likely never worked right. Riley stood in Eleanor Walsh's kitchen, staring at the same teacups she'd seen the day before, still exactly as they'd been. One untouched, one half-drunk. No forced entry, no sign of a struggle, no fingerprints that didn't belong. But someone had come in, or been there all along. Anne had been processed and released into supervised custody for now. No charge, just observation. She was rattled, deeply, but not violent. Riley was certain of that. The attic story, strange as it was, rang with something most lies didn't. Sorrow without defense. No manipulation. No polish. Just the disjointed language of someone who had come undone long before they were found. Riley reached down and picked up the paperback Anne had mentioned. Charlotte's Web. Its spine was split in the middle, cracked at the seam where Charlotte spins her first word into the web. Some pig. A slip of folded paper had been pressed between the pages. Riley unfolded it. To begin again, I must finish first. There's more of me than they remember. I need them to know the rest. Not signed. Not addressed. The handwriting matched a note Vega had bagged earlier, one tucked under the bowl of lentil soup left on the attic steps 2 weeks ago. Be warm. Riley. Turned the paper over. Nothing else. She pocketed it and looked toward the hallway. The door to Eleanor's bedroom remained ajar. She hadn't entered it before. Not fully. There had been too much chaos, too many people. Now she walked in. The bedroom was spare, but not cold. A faded floral bedspread, a small writing desk in the corner, a wall of books carefully arranged by spine color. The kind of order that only came from someone trying to control the few things they still could. On the desk, a row of old letters bound in twine. Yellowed envelopes, some unopened. She glanced down and noticed something small. A gap in the dust on the floor near the radiator. Riley crouched. Someone had recently moved the desk slightly to the left, just enough to hide a square cut into the floorboard, faint but visible to trained eyes. She retrieved her penlight, pried gently with the flat of her badge, and lifted a shallow panel. Beneath it, a wooden box. Locked, but old. She brought it out and laid it on the desk. A hairline. Crack ran along the clasp. Not new. A sign that someone else had tried, and failed, to open it before. Riley studied it for another minute, then set it aside. She wouldn't force it there. Not yet. Her phone buzzed. Vega. Toxicology report just came back. Trace amounts of chloral hydrate in Eleanor's system. Not enough to kill, but enough to sedate. Also, fingerprints on the attic hatch. Eleanor, Anne, and someone from 3A. Bret Easton. Riley blinked. 3A. The overly helpful young tenant. The one who always seemed just nervous enough to avoid suspicion. The one who handed her the building's key log as if it were his own duty. She made her way. Up, Bret Easton opened his door after the second knock, sweater wrinkled, hair wet from a rushed shower. He smiled. Quick, tight, defensive. Detective, is everything all right? I have some questions, Riley said, her tone mild. Do you have a moment? Of course, sure, yeah. Come in. Sorry for the mess. I wasn't expecting... She stepped inside. The apartment was tidy, but lived in. Lots of plants. An unplugged record player with a Miles Davis sleeve left half inserted. An open laptop on the couch with an unfinished crossword paused mid-grid. Nice place, she said, scanning. You mentioned you were close with Eleanor? He nodded. Not close, but she was kind. We talked sometimes. On the stairs. I helped her carry her groceries once a week. You ever go into her apartment? He hesitated. A beat too long. Once or twice. She asked me to fix her printer. Last fall, I didn't stay. Ever go up to the attic? He looked down. No, that place gives me the creeps. But your fingerprints are on the latch. A pause. Okay. Maybe once. I was looking for the building fuse box after the second floor lost power. She said it was up there, but the door was locked. I tried the latch, but it didn't open. Riley watched his hands. Too still. Eleanor was drugged the night she died, she said quietly. Something sedative. Not fatal, but enough to keep her still. Bret paled. His throat bobbed. Jesus. You think someone... I think someone knew her schedule. Knew the attic was occupied. Knew the building's keys, the routines. Someone who blended in. She stepped closer. Someone who wanted to know things, but never be seen knowing them. I didn't hurt her, he said suddenly. I liked her. That doesn't mean you didn't need something from her, Riley replied. Guilt, maybe, or forgiveness. His voice cracked. I wasn't even supposed to be here. What do you mean? He sat down, shoulders hunched. I'm not Bret Easton. That's my brother's name. I use it for leases. Mine's Evan. I've been couch hopping since last year. Bret helped me fake this rental. He doesn't even live here. He's in DC. I just needed a place to land for a while. And Eleanor? New? She found out 2 months ago. She didn't turn me in. She said people hide for all kinds of reasons, and that I didn't need to tell her mine. Just not to lie again. What is your reason? Riley asked. He hesitated. I was part of a securities firm. We did consulting on investment portfolios, and one of our clients ran a Ponzi scheme. Millions. I found out too late. When it imploded, I walked away. No charges, but my name was blacklisted everywhere. I needed quiet. I thought this place would let me disappear. But Eleanor saw you? She did. And she said disappearing only works if you're okay, never being found. Back in her car, Riley sat with the box in her lap. She pried it open with a slender file. Slowly, deliberately. Inside, letters. Dozens of them, written in Eleanor's handwriting. Addressed, never sent, each one to Anne. Spanning 15 years, Riley read one at random. October 9th, 2013. I don't know if I'll ever see you again, but I dreamt of your 7th birthday last night. You were wearing that striped shirt you loved. You insisted it made you run faster. I made a cake. You laughed with all your teeth showing. I want to remember you that way, before we both grew sharp. Another, December 3rd, 2018. I lied to your father once. I said I didn't blame him. But I did. I blamed him for leaving, for taking pieces of you with him. But now I wonder if I did the same. I wasn't good at grief. I wore it like armor, but it turned to glass. They went on, line after line, not a confession, but a breadcrumb trail of a life undone slowly, not suddenly, and then the final one, dated 2 days before her death. She's here. She finally came. I should be terrified, but I'm not. I think this time I'll get to say what I never could. And if I don't, maybe this will be enough. She is still mine. And I will love her, even if it breaks me to. Riley exhaled. This wasn't just a mystery of death. It was one of erasure, of people trying to vanish, and the lives that refused. To let them, Anne, Evan, even Eleanor in her own way, someone had walked through that grief. Someone who saw it and chose to twist it. There was one last thread Riley hadn't pulled, one person who'd stayed conveniently out of reach, out of suspicion, and now she knew exactly who to find. Rain slicked the sidewalks by the time Riley returned to the building. A hard, needling drizzle that blurred edges and quieted everything beneath its touch. The city had slipped into late afternoon shadows, windows glowing gold against gray, steam lifting from manholes like ghosts that couldn't settle. She didn't knock this time. She climbed to the 2nd floor, paused outside apartment 2B, and listened. There was movement inside. Slow. Controlled. Marjorie Lott had been in and out of every room in that building the week Eleanor died, delivering groceries, checking in on Anne, walking her rescue terrier up and down the 5 flights twice a day. Always there, always helpful, always peripheral. Riley had noted her early, but there had been nothing to pin down. Until now. Now there was the attic. Now there were Eleanor's letters. Now there was that lock. New, replaced weeks before Eleanor's. Death, paid for in cash through a handyman Riley hadn't traced back to Anne or Eleanor. But Marjorie's phone records, subpoenaed that morning, placed a call to the same number. 1 week before Eleanor died, Riley knocked. Once. Firm. A pause. Then, it's open. Riley stepped inside. The apartment was dim, curtains drawn, a lemon-scented candle flickering on a side table. Marjorie stood near the window, her gray cardigan, hanging loose over her shoulders, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug. "You've come," she said without looking back. "I thought maybe you would." "Why?" Riley asked. "Because I've lived long enough to know what a detective sounds. Like when they stop circling." Riley glanced around. Everything in the apartment was soft. The couch cushions sagging from years of use, the framed photo of a cat long dead, the calendar flipped to May but still marked with Eleanor's birthday in neat handwriting. "I spoke to Evan," Riley said. "Watching her. He told me about the alias, about disappearing into this place like fog." Marjorie nodded. "He's not the first to do it. Won't be the last. The city's full of ghosts still breathing. Did you know Eleanor was writing to Anne?" I suspected. But Eleanor kept her grief folded tight. She never trusted anyone with the whole truth. She trusted someone, Riley said. Someone enough to change the attic lock. Someone who knew Anne was there and didn't tell anyone. Someone who watched that grief come back through the door and decided to act. To act. Marjorie's hands tightened around her mug. You think that was me? I know it was. The silence settled like dust. Long. Unmoving. When Marjorie finally turned, her eyes were calm. Not defensive. Just tired. I never meant for her to die. Then tell me what you did mean. Marjorie set the mug down, walked slowly to the bookshelf, pulled a faded envelope from between two gardening books, and held it out. Riley opened it. Inside, a letter, in Eleanor's hand. Marjorie, if you find her, if she ever comes back, don't tell her everything at once. She won't survive. The weight. She's fragile in ways she hides. Let her see me as human first. Let her choose to stay. Riley looked up. Marjorie's voice was thin now. She came to me 3 weeks ago, disoriented, sick. She barely remembered her name. She said she'd been living in shelters, that something snapped and she walked north until she couldn't anymore. I took her in, quietly, fed her. I didn't tell Eleanor at first. I thought it would crush her. But you did tell her. Eventually, when Anne started asking questions, when she wanted to know what was above her. Marjorie rubbed her temple. Eleanor insisted on seeing her, said it was time. But she was terrified. Not of Anne, of what she'd become in Anne's eyes. So you arranged it. Marjorie nodded. I replaced the attic lock, made it so only Eleanor and I had keys. I cleaned up the room. I thought it might be healing for them both. But it wasn't. Marjorie swallowed hard. No, it wasn't. She crossed back to the window and sat slowly. Eleanor went up that night. I didn't go with her. I thought it was theirs. Not mine. But when I checked the next morning, she was gone. Quiet. Peaceful. Like she'd fallen asleep. Her voice cracked. There was no sign of struggle. Just that letter. The one she left me. I thought, maybe it was mercy. You found Eleanor dead in the attic? Yes. And you moved her downstairs, into her bed, cleaned the cups, hid the truth. She deserved dignity, Marjorie whispered. And Anne didn't remember anything. She was already slipping. Again. I couldn't let them blame her. Riley stared at her, the shape of the truth slowly locking into place. She was sedated, Riley said. Someone gave her something. Marjorie shook her head. Not me. I swear to you, I didn't. Oh. Knock at the door cut her off. Vega stepped in, holding a clear evidence bag. Inside, a brown glass vial. The label rubbed off, but still faintly legible. Chloral hydrate. Found it under the loose board in the attic, he said. Prints match Anne and Eleanor. Riley frowned. Eleanor? Vega nodded. Lab says dosage was self-administered. She took it voluntarily. Marjorie closed her eyes. She wanted a quiet goodbye. Riley exhaled slowly. The shape of it all. Tragedy, not crime. Grief, not malice, but not innocence either. You still moved her? Riley said. You still made it a lie. I thought I was protecting them both. Riley didn't answer right away. She turned, walked to the window, looked down at the street. The rain had stopped. The world glistened with the kind of stillness that only came after storms. Later, in Eleanor's apartment, Riley sat at the small writing desk. The box of letters lay open beside her. She read the last one again. And if I don't, maybe this will be enough. It had been. In its way. Not justice, not resolution, but understanding. Sometimes that was all people could leave behind. Riley stood, placed the letter back inside, and closed the box. She took one last look at the room. Then, turned off the light and walked away.